Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we want to talk about the future of agriculture because ultimately we need to think about how are we going to feed this growing population without destroying the ecosystem. And what we're going to need to see in the future is really more space and more efficient, sustainable land use overall. And this is an interesting thing because we don't have more land. This is something we talk about all the time. The geography is what it is, right? Climates aren't gonna be something we can modify intentionally. Climates change on their own. Climates change because we change things, right? We cut down forests, that changes the climate. Carbon dioxide changes the climate. But ultimately, this is not something that we have a controlled outcome for, right? So how do we get more space? And that's a really good question. Now, efficient and sustainable land use, that's something that's a lot easier than creating more space. So we're going to be looking at both of these things sort of separately. Ideally, though, whatever space we are using will always want to be more efficient and sustainably used. We're going to have to limit our inputs, right? So when we talk about limiting inputs, we're talking about water use, fertilizer use, pesticide use. And we have an idea about what a good way to do that is, but that idea may not actually be true. So we want to talk about that. We also need to manage the increasing demand for both meat and fish. So rising affluence always creates a higher demand for meat, and fish is already a huge part of lots and lots of diets around the world. And as populations rise and as affluence rises, we have big pressures on both of these areas as well. So we're not just talking about farming, we're also talking about ranching and fishing. The other thing is we need our foods themselves to be more nutritious. And this is one of the ways that we're going to combat hunger and we're going to alleviate some of the food security issues that we see around the world. So what are our major challenges? Food still will need to be affordable. So we can't have so much technology and specialization that we can't make affordable food. We also don't want food to be so scarce that it becomes something that everyone can't have access to, right? We need to monitor the stability in food supplies. We don't want the supply of food to vary wildly depending on what's happening, and we want everyone to have access to food. And that does not mean taking food from one location and distributing it to another location, because that creates food dependency, and that's something else we don't want to see. We need to maintain stable food supplies in every country. All right, so one of the things that's required is a shift to sustainable agriculture. And this is also a challenge, right? How do you do that? We have lots of embedded infrastructure around farming, both in developed and developing nations, that is not super sustainable at this moment in time going forward. So we need to minimize the impact on biodiversity and native ecosystems. And we probably need to strengthen native ecosystems in order to strengthen our agricultural systems. We need to limit the contribution to climate change. We need to maintain the soil and water quality, and we need to limit pollution at the same time that we increase yields. We've got to do all of that while we increase yields too. That is a huge challenge. So ultimately at this point we need to decide what is sustainable agriculture. And sustainable agriculture are the agricultural practices that are going to minimize environmental and ecological pressures, right? So things that will conserve non-renewable energy sources, things that will seek out alternate renewable energy sources, right? We need to create and conserve healthy soil. That means that we've got to use less fertilizer, more polyculture, organic fertilizers, if we are using fertilizers, and crop rotation. And by the way, there are many ways to create and conserve healthy soil. These are just some of the more maybe doable or common ones. We need to conserve and protect our water resources. That means we need to use less of it, and we need to contaminate fewer of our waterways. That means less runoff, right? Thinking about hypoxic zones in the Gulf, in part due to fertilizer use in the Midwest. We need to recycle and manage our waste products better. So methane production from manure, that can be used to power various things on farms, right? Manure can also be used as fertilizer, right? There are places that farm both animals and grains or vegetables or whatever. And they'll oftentimes feed the animals with the grain they grow, and they'll use the manure from the animals to fertilize the grains. This is a great system that you can do. You can also compost any of the residual stuff that's left over from your crops, called crop residue. It's all of like the stalks and leaves and stuff that you're not using. That can be composted into beautiful organic fertilizer. We also need to select our livestock and our crop that is appropriate for the ecosystem that it's going into, right? So you obviously would not want to try to grow bananas in Nevada. You're talking about a high water tropical crop. Trying to grow it in the desert is a terrible, terrible idea. And so we need to make sure that we are really looking into what kinds of crops and animals, livestock, are really the best for the area in which we want to raise them. And that means that people will have to start thinking about, maybe I can't have mangoes all year round and I live in Wisconsin, right? That just may be something that we have to get used to, seasonal shifting crops, right? The way that it used to be when we were all raising our own food. The other thing that we've been looking at are native species, and they're very promising. But it requires a big attitude shift, right? People have to think about, well, maybe I don't want a beef hamburger. Maybe I'd like a bison hamburger or an elk burger or a moose burger or whatever, right? And we have to start intentionally raising those native species instead of non-native species, because we can't just harvest them out of the wild because that will deplete them from their ecosystems. So this is a big change, right? The other thing that we need to do is manage pests better. We need to do it with minimal environmental impact. The answer right now is to put lots of pesticides on it. And fortunately, there are some other ways to do it. And lots of people have started to use less pesticides because they're shifting to things like GMOs. They're using natural biological cycles and various natural controls for pests. And so we're seeing a decrease. The great thing about decreasing fertilizer use and pesticide use is that sometimes by using less, you can actually increase your yields. Over fertilizing decreases yields. Using lots of chemicals on your crops can actually decrease yields. Some chemicals boost yields. Lots of chemicals decrease yields. Now, the other thing that's really important is that while we are being sustainable, we can't do it at the cost of economic survival of farming and at the well-being of farmers and their families. If farming becomes a job that is so meager that people can't survive off the income, if it's so difficult, if there's so many regulations that you just can't get anything done, people are not going to want to be farmers. And if people don't want to be farmers, then we don't have any food. So we have to ensure that it's a sustainable lifestyle and business for farming families at the same time that we make sure that it's sustainable for the environment, and there is a balance there. So what are we going to talk about in this conversation, right? We want to talk about some of the ways that we see having sustainable agriculture that is also economically viable. And the first big way, and probably the oldest in kind of the new farming style, is the gene revolution, biotech, right? So what is the best definition of biotechnology? The use of living organisms to make desired products, the development of genetic engineering, curing diseases, the use of microorganisms in sewage treatment, or none of these? Basically, when we talk about biotech, we're talking about the use of living organisms to make desired products. And this is something that we've been doing for thousands of years, right? As long as we've made bread, we have been using organisms to make desired products. So biotech is something that has been around for a really long time. Now, in modern times, when we start talking about biotechnology, we're talking about some of these more sophisticated things like genetic engineering, like using microorganisms in sewage treatment. But the answer to what is biotech is actually number one here. All right, so what are genetically modified organisms? Because when we think biotech in modern times, we oftentimes think about GMOs, right? And when we talk about GMOs, we're talking about organisms to which we've added a gene, deleted a gene, or changed a gene. Oftentimes, those genes come from other unrelated organisms, okay? And so what you're looking at here is an adorable glow cat, and here you have golden rice. And the glow cat has a jellyfish gene that is a green phosphorescent protein, and the cat is just fine. It's just that when you put UV light on it, it fluoresces. The golden rice has a gene from a daffodil to make it higher in vitamin A content, and this actually would go a long way to helping blindness in children and vitamin A deficiencies. And the only difference between regular rice and golden rice is that vitamin A gene causing the increase in vitamin A. So when we talk about plant breeding in particular, and this is true for animals as well, we are talking about really two things. You've got the traditional way where you have two individuals, you breed them together, and then you get sort of just a mix-up of whatever the genes that you have are, and you continue to do that until you get an outcome that you like, right? And then you just keep breeding those. And that's when we think about show dogs, for instance. And actually, that's true with every domesticated breed of anything that we've ever made, right? Not just show dogs, cows, corn, whatever. The other more specific, more targeted way to get traits into an organism is to actually genetically engineer them. And what that means is that your donor organism doesn't give all of its DNA like it does in traditional breeding. It gives only a single or set of genes, right? And so then you put that into the new organism, and then the new organism, right, has just that gene in it, as opposed to the traditional breeding, which is a mix of all the genes. Okay? Now, here's an example. One of the earliest kind of widespread uses of biotech was to put a gene from a bacteria, soil bacteria, called Bacillus thuringiensis, which we're going to call BT from now on. What this bacteria produces a toxin for the European corn borer. And so it actually doesn't use it, right? Because the corn borer doesn't eat dirt, it eats corn. But we can take that out and we can insert it into the corn. And now when the corn borer eats the corn that has the gene, it will die because it's being produced by the corn, right? And so that's a really good example. BT gene is in corn, soy, and cotton. All right, genetic engineering has been used to do all of the following except make plants more resistant to frost, make plants more resistant to disease, make hybrids of various plants to make them hardier, make plants more resistant to herbicides, or to improve the nutritional balance of plants. Well, all of these are examples of genetic engineering except hybridizing. Hybridizing is where you take two different species and traditionally breed them together to get some offspring that is a cross of the two of them. That is actually traditional breeding. So hybridizing something is not genetic engineering. Okay, so why would we use GMOs? Well, all of the things in the question I just asked you. We can insert really desirable traits, right? So we can increase yields by figuring out how we're losing crops and then changing the crop loss issue, right? And so that may be that the crop doesn't grow as fast or develop as fast, and so we can't get as much out as we could, right? And so this little mouse has a gene that allows it to grow faster. And on the market right now is a salmon that grows 4 times as fast as regular salmon. It's called the Aqua Bounty salmon. And it has a gene that has increased its growth, right? It develops faster. So that's one way you can actually increase yields, right? More berries, more whatever, okay? Bigger, faster. You can also combat the idea of having a certain yield but then losing some of it. So we can physically increase yields or we can stop the loss of existing yields. And that's where we come into the idea of resistance, whether it is to some sort of pest, to an herbicide, so you can kill other plants that grow in the fields without killing your crops, virus resistance, fungus resistance, or to environmental conditions, maybe resistance to drought, maybe tolerance for salt as salinization increases, whatever it is. These are things that'll increase yields that way. And this is really kind of what we're looking at. This is the big focus when we're talking about GM products. Mostly we're trying to increase yields. Okay, so what are the advantages, right? Well, it turns out that when you use GM and you have pesticide introduced into the crop so that it's making its own pesticides, you don't actually have to put inorganic chemicals on the crops as much, right? You can substitute less hazardous herbicides, less hazardous pesticides, and that's a really helpful thing. And so it allows greater use of no-till agriculture, and in the long run it ends up reducing erosion and runoff because you're not having to put all of these extra chemicals there. And so you get more productivity on less land. Right? Now, there are other things that you can do. It doesn't just have to be about the growing side. What about the consumer side, right? You might want to have something where you increase the flavor so it's more desirable. You might want to have something that lasts longer on the shelf, right? Like the Flavor Saver tomato, which was the very first GM product on the market. You might want to make something that's easier to process, that requires less energy to process, right? You might want something that has a better texture. So think about, we use soy to make a lot of meat alternatives, but what if you could have something that was plant-based but that had the texture of actual meat? That might be a more desirable product. We also want to increase the nutritional value. This is something we talked about, making sure that our food was more nutritious so we could combat hunger, right? That's a big deal. We can do this with GMO. Golden rice is a good example of that. Going forward, there's also the possibility that we could use GM crops for vaccines. Instead of getting shots, might just be able to eat a bowl of oatmeal that has the vaccine in it because the oats produce the vaccine. Maybe medications. Maybe you could eat a tomato that has your heart medication in it. Whatever happens. This, by the way, is called farming, P-H-A-R-M-I-N-G. The other thing that we can do with it is that we can produce other proteins like plastics. So you can make bioplastics instead of making them out of oil. Those are things that are much farther in the future than the consumer-based traits. All right, so what are the sources of opposition to GM? And by the way, we could spend all year talking about GM products, but we're just going to do it for a little bit. Food safety, how do we know that foods from biotech crops are safe, right? What about acceptance by consumers? Are they affordable? Can they really help produce more higher quality food? The answer to that is yes, by the way. And how do we know that GM crops won't, in the long run, harm the environment? And these are really good questions, right? So let's talk about food safety. We know that proteins cause unexpected allergic responses in people, and so there is the idea of increasing resistance to pests and creating superbugs, and then there's the production of new toxic substances. What happens when you put a gene, maybe it's on another biochemical pathway in this new organism, and you get a toxin that you never knew existed before? Well, all GM products have to be rigorously tested. They look for all of these things, and they're tested on average at least 10 years before moving on to field trials. Now, what about the economic and social impacts, right? What about access to the new technologies? Is it profit driven? Well, maybe. I mean, people argue that it's all about making money because the seeds are sterile and it's called Terminator technology and you have to buy new seeds every year. Well, this could get expensive, except most farmers have to buy new seeds anyway. And the reason that GM products are sterile is to prevent them from getting out into the environment. And this is one of the ways that we make sure that GM products are safe for the ecosystem, right? If they can't hybridize, if they can't pollinate other plants, then that makes them a whole lot safer. And so that's actually not a profit-driven component. That is a safety component, and that's really important to understand. There's some question about their affordability in developing countries, and that's a legitimate concern. But you could say that about any product. You could say that about any new product. All right, what about consumer acceptance? Do people really want blue roses? And this is an interesting thing, right? People, in fact, in the rose community do seem to want a blue rose, but the only way that you can get it is through GM, and that seems to be okay. Consumers seem to be split mostly when it comes to food, right? Most people have heard about GM products. Just less than half of those people avoid eating them. And many of them don't seem to really understand one, the benefits or the science behind that. There's all kinds of ideas about how GM products aren't easy to digest or whatever, and all of that is actually nonsense, right? The only thing that you've done is add in one gene that does something in particular. It actually does not affect the rest of the plant at all, right? If it goes on the market, it's because the rest of the plant has not been affected. But this is an interesting thing. People really want to protect the environment, and they think that's really important. And they want to protect the environment in particular from chemicals. But then they also want to avoid genetically engineered products, which are things that protect the environment from chemicals. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And if you actually look at these, protecting the environment from chemicals such as pesticides, reducing exposure to pesticides, reducing the use of antibiotics, and avoiding artificial ingredients, those can actually all be limited, less this, but in some ways you could, by having genetically modified ingredients. So there's kind of a disconnect there. And GMOs are already really prevalent. I just wanted to show you this graph about what we're actually planting. And then thinking geography-wise, who's using them? Lots of places, right? Lots of places. Lots of areas are either growing or importing GM products. Okay, so we're going to shift from GM and I want to talk a little bit about aquaculture because remember that fish farm idea. Right now, most of the fish and seafood that you get is actually wild caught. And that is a huge pressure on fisheries. And fisheries are, in fact, just ecosystems. And when you put these huge pressures on fisheries and you make them threatened or vulnerable, what you're really doing is putting that pressure on an existing wild ecosystem. And so, how can we take some of those pressures off fisheries? Well, the answer to that is ultimately fish farms. And we're seeing lots more fish farms. And fish farms can either be completely isolated, like just regular old farms, or they can be just offshore. And this is where, so freshwater fish farms tend to be like completely isolated or they are put into man-made lakes. Near shore fish farms are saltwater, so this is going to be like your salmon and stuff. And then there's some issues with the near shore. This is probably the most environmentally impacting type of farming. So the regular, like isolated freshwater fish farms, those seem to be just, fine. They most of the time, unless there's a flooding event, they don't really interact with natural waterways. But nearshore farms are right on the coast. They are actually embedded into an existing ecosystem. And the fish that are in these are in high density. They get sick from wild fish, and then because they're high density, you get illness throughout the whole farm. They also, because they're high density, have a lot of waste that they produce. And they themselves produce the waste in feces, but they also have a lot of wasted fish food, and both of those things act as fertilizers. And the biggest issue that you really see with your near shore fisheries is that you have a high nutrient load in the water because of that uneaten fish food and that excessive amount of waste. And so you get lots of nitrogens, and so you end up fouling the area for native species, and that's kind of a big deal. People are working on ways to fix that, and one of the really big ways is to look at the offshore farms. This is something that it's in its infancy, so if you're excited about aquaculture, offshore fisheries seem to be a really good solution because there's so much good water flow and you're not right there at the bottom, that the nutrient load is distributed and you have good, fresh, clean areas. Again, they're still doing a lot of research on this. Okay, so what about farms? Unconventional farming methods are how we're going to get this more space, right? We've talked about sustainable agriculture. We've talked about GM products, which are actually a huge part of sustainable agriculture. But let's talk about really unconventional farming methods. So the first thing in that's really simple is green roofs, right? If you can use the space on top of buildings and homes, you can really start reclaiming a lot of that urban landscape for farms. And that's a great thing to do. And you'll see it in lots and lots of places, right? Whether it is growing just parks, green space as a carbon sink, or whether it's growing actual fruits and vegetables and herbs for use. It's a great way to combat food deserts, and it's a great way to mitigate the heat island effect of urban areas and help temperature and weather. All right, so while we're thinking about buildings, instead of using just the top of the building, what if you use the entire building, right? Vertical farming can be as simple as just hydroponics, where you have nutrient solutions, no soil, and you kind of just have racks of plants. And that, by the way, can be as simple as some PVC pipes and a fish pump in your backyard. Lots of DIY stuff on Pinterest, on the internet. It can also be something that you can incorporate into existing buildings where you have sort of micro farms on the walls or windows, and that's a great way to go. There's another version of this called aeroponics, where it doesn't need the water, it's just a mist instead of flowing water. So all kinds of things there. You can also incorporate fish, where you have the fish waste that was such a problem in the nearshore fish farms. You can actually use that as the fertilizer for your plants that you're growing. And so you can have this nice aquaponics system, and those are really common. We actually have had several attempts for those here, and we have fish here in a little mini fish farm. But that can look all kinds of in all kinds of ways. The other thing that you can also grow vertically is algae, right? And algae has lots of uses, and you already have lots of algae in your life that you don't even know about, because it's in cosmetics, it's in ice cream, it's in vitamins, it's in pigments, it's in fertilizer. But you can also use it for pollution control, and you can use it as a substitute when you're making biodiesel, right? And so you can actually make biodiesel out of algae, and that's very exciting. And I have put in here a list of things that you can do with algae. It's in the PowerPoint, so check that out. Now, while we're talking about these vertical farms, we can also think, okay, well, if I can do this on a small scale, I could do it on a big scale. You could turn a whole building into a vertical farm. And this is called skyscraper farming, and this has a lot of potential. I don't know anybody that's actually doing this for real, but it has a huge amount of potential. So vertical farming could replace all types of conventional agriculture, true or false? This is actually false. Conventional agriculture is still going to be very necessary for your grain crops in particular, but you could really do a lot of vertical farming with fruits and vegetables, and that's a good thing. So this is where you can see some of that fruits and vegetables. This is another reason that this is great for urban settings, right? To take buildings that are not occupied, especially like buildings in our own downtown, and you can really have these big farms. You can employ local people growing food for their communities. It's a very cool idea, but it doesn't replace all types of agriculture. What about meat? Well, we talked about wild native species, wildlife, but there's some non-traditional meats out there too that are kind of helping. There are two in particular that are kind of the meat of the future. One is helpful for people who do not want to consume actual meat, and that is harvesting plant proteins. This is a GM thing, by the way, and having them behave like animal proteins to make meat-like products. And there are people who are doing this for meat and eggs, and it's very interesting. The other thing that people are doing is using stem cells. So taking muscle cells and actually growing lab-originated muscle tissue. And that's what you're seeing here. This is lab-originated muscle tissue. And so the idea is that you would not have to grow the whole animal at all. You would only grow the parts that you want to eat. And that, of course, would really change a lot. I mean, think about beef, right? You wouldn't have to deal with the whole cow. You wouldn't have to have them on the range. You wouldn't have the methane production, which is a greenhouse issue. You wouldn't have the waste issue. You wouldn't have the land issues like overgrazing and compaction. You would just have a bunch of labs that just give you hamburger, right? And that's a really interesting idea. People, by and large, when they do research polls, think this is not cool. They think it's gross. But in reality, how is it any different than cutting up an animal, right? Seems much more humane. But you get to decide how you feel about that. But those are some really non-traditional meat solutions. All right. If you are interested in any agriculture or biotech jobs, I have put a link in the PowerPoint for you. And I've also put this in. I think this is really cool. This is which life science applications will see the most tech growth over the next 5 years, right? So if you're thinking about fields that you could be really successful in and you want to help people, agriculture, biotech. All right. This has been a lot of information, like a lot of information. We could have spent the entire semester on all of this information. Actually, we could have spent years, right? But you get a quick snapshot of a lot of different things. Please make sure that you've written down your questions so we can talk about them in class next time. And thanks for listening. See you next time.